So everybody, thank you for coming tonight. Sorry for the last minute invitation. So our program tonight is on bacon, American bacon. So our program tonight is Mark Johnson, who was, I believe, born and raised in Milwaukee or in that region, and he now lives in Tennessee. And the book he published is from the University of Georgia, which is just fine with me. So I could easily ruin his career by doing my ad lib introduction. So I'm going to turn it over to Mark to introduce himself. Thank you, Mark, for all your patience tonight.
Oh, of course, no problem. I'm happy to be here. Thanks for having me. Yeah, so I'm an assistant professor of history at the University of Tennessee at Chattanooga, and at UTC, I teach U.S. history, food history, and U.S. history with an emphasis on race and class in the United States. So, as of this week, my new book, American Bacon, is available, as Kathy said, through the University of Georgia Press or bookstores near you. And I'm looking forward to talking about it here tonight. So, in the 1980s, bacon's reputation was struggling. In the preceding decades, the nation's doctors, nutritionists, and scientists had condemned it as the most fattening and cancer-causing food in the supermarket. In 1987, the National Pork Board debuted its famous The Other White Meat campaign to compete with poultry, which had become the powerhouse protein of the 20th century. The campaign emphasized the leaner cuts of pork, like tenderloins. In the National Pork Board's own literature, dietitians and chefs recommended cutting back on bacon and substituting leaner cuts of pork. So, with the emphasis on fat-free dieting, farmers raised the leanest possible hogs engineered by science. The US government persuaded meat packers at this time to sell pork bellies, which had become as low as 19 cents per pound, as a cheap export and as a food aid to impoverished nations and victims of natural disasters. According to Joe Leathers, who worked in the pork industry during his entire career, for Hormel. He said there was such little demand that the US was literally giving them away. And then Tim Myers of the Illinois Pork Producers Association said pork belly was a drag on the carcass. So in 2012, this book by B. Wilson, Consider the Fork, she says, bacon serves no real purpose in a refrigerated age except that of pleasure, which can never be discounted. And so in this book, I take that very seriously as my departure point and shed light on the way taste or distaste for bacon has revealed what it has revealed about society and culture in the United States. In this story, bacon will transition from mundane staple to culturally backward poverty food to dangerous threat, then to pop up in the 21st century as a cultural icon and gastronomic phenomenon. As a kitchen staple, it no longer worked. As a dangerous, decadent indulgence, however, it sold more than ever. In other words, Americans have made bacon a symbol of pleasure, even desire, amid prevailing norms and values that emphasize self-restraint, leanness, and self-denial. For a very long time in early modern Western Europe, including Great Britain and then North American colonies, people ate bacon. They relied on it. After all, it was a relatively shelf-stable meat, product for all classes that people could add in small pieces to their stews, porridges, greens, and other humble meals. In fact, it came to be such a staple that it became associated with the Dunmow-Flitch trials. And that's where married couples competed to, quote, bring home the bacon. They would go to Dunmow once a year on the anniversary of their wedding, on their first anniversary, and they had to convince a jury that they had never once regretted their marriage, and if they could do so and bring witnesses to testify to that effect, they would earn a whole side of bacon. It's since been replaced by a wooden emblem instead of an actual side of bacon. But nonetheless, the ritual testifies to the way that a pig and its bacon were essential to starting a life together. By Elizabethan England, and that's when England got started going to the American colonies. Um, by Elizabethan England, plenty of people still ate plenty of bacon, but the attitudes toward it had changed decisively, and people differentiated themselves by the variety of their diet. In other words, everyone continued to keep eating bacon, but there were only some classes of people that were considered dependent on it and became actually known as bacon eaters or chaw bacons, bacon chewers as an insult, similar to our phrase today, like country yokel or bumpkin or something like that. So I think this happens for a few reasons. First, England's urbanizing, and in the cities, people experience one of those strange paradoxes of the last few centuries that city people can sometimes get more variety in their diets than country people. And so that's what's happening. In the cities, people take advantage of London's famous markets to get fresh meat and a variety of meat. So once liberated from bacon, they truly look to get their hands on anything else they can. The city's urban apprentices, for example, demand fresher food and more variety from their um, guild masters, for example. Meanwhile, England's starting to idealize its finely fenced, neat, orderly English farm, meaning sheep and cows fit perfectly in this image. These are two animals that famously demand a lot of care and attention and oversight. But rowdy and nefarious pigs do not. And so they start to portray the pig as a remnant of their own so-called uncivilized past. So by Elizabeth in England, they're starting to portray beef and mutton as more respectable and more civilized, and starting to portray pork, especially salt-cured smoked bacon, as a remnant of the past. These are the ideas that the English bring with them to North America. Um, According to one schoolmaster and physician, Thomas Cogan, in his book, The Haven of Health, he says, gross meat is meat for gross men. Bacon is in no ways commended as wholesome, especially for students or such as have feeble stomachs. But for laboring men, it is convenient. In such kind of men, it forceth not how much wholesome meat be, so it fill the belly and keep strength. So, in other words, brain workers like his students should avoid at all costs bacon in their diet. This is an idea that comes with the English to North America, that bacon was suitable for laboring people, but not really anyone else. In British North America, therefore, this provides colonists with a dilemma. On one hand, they want to replicate these English tastes, but they look around them and see a plethora of pigs and bacon around them. And they start to measure, literally and figuratively, the distance between their situation on the fringe of the empire and the taste and respectability of fashionable London. So, for some people in British North America, this causes a lot of anxiety. They would like to see more beef and mutton in the American diet. And therefore, and by doing so, close that like taste and respectability gap with the mother country. Right at this time, they really do want to mimic the tastes and fashions of England. And so the dependence on pigs and pork and bacon in particular just continues to signal to them, at least in their own minds, their backwardness compared to the mother country. For others, however, pigs and bacon come to represent a hardworking spirit, humility in the diet, and the virtue of the people in the Americas. Due to New England's varied diet and climate, New England's wealthier people were best able, out of all the people in the Americas, to replicate English tastes and those preferences for beef and mutton. Um, and so, like their English forebears, New Englanders turned bacon into a kind of insult. In 1676, this is poet Benjamin Thompson. and he's lacking the condition and lack of prosperity in New England after King Philip's War. From his perspective, he's lamenting that so much had changed as the English had crossed the Atlantic and waged war with Native Americans. And so he has this poem, and this is just a few lines of it. But he says here, and here methinks I see this greasy lout with all his pagan slaves coiled round about. Assuming all the majesty his throne of rotten stump or the rugged stone could yield, casting some bacon rind looks enough to fright a student from his books. And so Thompson's reference here to frightening bacon rind looks sustains the notion that while bacon was good for manual laborers, it was not for people who worked with their brains. During the early 19th century, the US had a reputation as a bacon eating place. But among US Americans, Southerners had a reputation for their dependence on bacon. So I think it goes a little something like this. So when Europeans visit the United States, they think of all Americans as backward bacon eating people. Okay. But within the United States, it's Northerners and urbanites who are starting to look at country people and poorer people, and especially Southerners, as the bacon eating people. And that's where I'm going to fast forward a little bit to the 1850s. Within the United States, Northerners and urbanites had started to get enmeshed in an industrialized food system, which you in Chicago know so much about, right? They're able, through Cincinnati and then increasingly through Chicago, to get finely dressed market style beef through the emerging technologies of the cold chain. And that means more variety, more fresh meat, and more beef than ever. In the South, these developments continue to lag behind. So the famous landscape architect and social critic and reformer, Frederick Law Olmsted, who you probably know as the designer of Central Park and other urban landscapes. But before he did any of that, he had a career as a journalist and a reformer, interested in the slave economy in particular. And so during the 1850s, he does a series of tours of the southern slaveholding states. And then, yeah, so great. So in 1853 and 1854, Olmsted travels the southern states and comments on the ubiquity of bacon in the diets of all types of Southerners. At one meal, he says, I made the first practical acquaintance with what shortly was to be the bane of my life, vis-a-vis cornbread and bacon. I partook innocent and unsuspicious of these dishes, without a thought that for the next 6 months I should actually see nothing else. And so, unlike the varied diets enjoyed by Northerners, Southerners, at least from Olmsted's view, seem to depend exclusively on it. And for Olmsted and other reformers, they know, at least in their minds, they know that there's a connection. They don't know if Southerners are backward because of their bacon eating, or if they're backward so they eat bacon. But nonetheless, this pops up over and over again as a symbol of the region's backwardness compared to the industrializing North. Now, while almost all Southerners ate bacon, they typically differentiated themselves based on class. While outsiders noted and complained about the ubiquity of bacon on the tables of all Southerners, wealthy Southerners likewise viewed their poorer white neighbors as excessively reliant on it. And they especially considered it suitable and even beneficial for the health of the millions of enslaved people who did the labor. And so this idea, rooted in early modern England, that bacon was suitable for laboring people but not anyone else, continues to persist into the late antebellum period and justifies at least in their minds. The ration of about 3.5 pounds of bacon per week per an enslaved field working man. So they consider bacon suitable for people on the frontier. Again, these are going to be people laboring. It makes sense for people moving to the frontier because it's shelf stable, easy to transport, and relatively cheap. On the plantations of the Deep South, bacon seems suitable for enslaved Black Southerners to such an extent that it gets tied up into emerging ideas about pseudoscientific racism. Bacon, from long experience, is known to be the most healthy meat diet in the world, according to the Southern cultivator, who adds particularly for Negroes, as they would say, who do most of the labor on the cotton plantation. And then this is a doctor, Dr. John F. Holston. He goes on to basically repeat the same thing, that bacon is useful for African Americans. Um, and they're rooting these ideas in actually ancient humoral theories. The ideas about the biles, right? Black, yellow, bile, and so on. The dry, wet, hot, and dry humors. And so basically, they argue that Black people, African Americans, um, cannot generate their own heat per the ideas of the time. And that's not suitable for a laboring person. So the uh, conventional wisdom of the period suggested feeding a heat generating agent, in which case bacon was perfectly suitable per the so-called scientific knowledge of the time for Black men laboring in the fields. And that's exactly what makes it unsuitable for white people, but also especially white women. There's another physician. His name is John Steinbach Wilson. He confirms all these ideas, and he becomes, during the Civil War, he's one of the Confederacy's like leading doctors and medical thinkers. He considers a high-fat diet essential for the laboring person. Um, and he says fat bacon and pork are peculiarly appropriate for African Americans and their habits of life. So, based on this pseudo-scientific racism of the time, many planters assured themselves, but also their critics, that their feeding of fatty pork, like bacon, and fatback was actually helpful or suitable. In 1855, and a Southern medical professional said, "It is a well-known fact that the more exhausting the labor, the fatter the meat um, that African Americans crave, and that it's the best food of this class for these people." So by emphasizing that these Black bodies, Black laboring enslaved bodies, need heat generating fat and grease, usually in the form of bacon, they effectively effeminized Black bodies. So they're basically saying that these Black men have the same humoral condition and humoral balance of white women. But while that's suitable for a white woman who ideally does not do any labor, that's unsuitable for a Black man. So they're effeminizing Black bodies and also using these ideas to justify their lack of self-control, their proclivity toward disease, and therefore their inferiority. So the Civil War unleashes a faith in a few things: big business, scientific expertise, and big government and bureaucracy. Um, For women, the post-Civil War period, or the Gilded Age and Progressive Era, is an opportunity to address not only the health of families, in which they've always had a role, but to address the health of their cities and their nations. And so it unleashes an army of dietary scientists health reformers, home economists, and so on. I'm talking about like the first generation of um, college educated women, mostly white, middle class, and upper class women who have this college education, but still face a job market that says that they shouldn't have jobs. And so they're able to turn their expertise in things like nutrition, chemistry, biology, uh, into reform movements, which becomes an acceptable sphere for their activity. So, due to the industrialized food system and the increasingly developing cold chain, people in the North can get fresh meat, fresh beef more often and cheaper than ever. Right in Chicago plays such a huge role in this story. So, after millennia, this seems very refreshing, right? To be able to liberate yourself from something other than bacon, right? This shelf-stable, cured product. And so they quickly start to associate bacon with the past and old stages of development. In an age of refrigeration, right, like B. Wilson said at the beginning of my talk, bacon's main advantage is no longer that useful. In the post-war South, however, these technologies like the cold chain and the reach of the industrial food system, and so that things like the railroad, and so refrigerated rail cars, um, these technologies lag behind in the South. So when Northerners look at the South, they're still continuing to see this place as antiquated, as backward, but not in a like charming or authentic way like it is now. Like Southern food and country music being so popular right now and looking to preserve the traditions of the past. No, that's not the case at all. And this time, these reformers look to the South and see it, yeah, not as quaint, but as a region of the country in desperate need of reform. And so that's what happens. The quote on the slide is from Catherine Pettit and May Stone. They started a settlement school in the style of Jane Addams and what she does in Chicago. They start one of these types of schools, but in the Mountain South, in Kentucky, Eastern Kentucky, specifically. So while Northerners and wealthier white Southerners observed that the diet of bacon and cornbread among white inhabitants of rural Eastern Kentucky, um, they view it as something that needs to get changed. And so they make the people's diet a key part of their reform work. And so they're continuing to repeat what Olmsted had said a few decades earlier, that these are people that rely on bacon and cornbread, um, and that they fry these things in as much bacon grease as they can get. So these women in particular, they aim to teach the women of Kentucky how to make good bread, what they call good bread, prepare more vegetables, and cook without so much grease. So for them, the problem's going beyond poor physical health. It's also an issue of morality and development towards civilization. When people look at the South, they link it with health and economic problems and worry about the implications of both for the nation's moral health. So by the 1930s, Northern scholars are observing that not much has changed, even still. According to this group of scholars, although living on abundant land in the South Temperate Zone, tenant families, so he's talking about sharecroppers in particular, tenant families have probably the most meager and ill-balanced diet of any large group in America. And they still note the dependence on bacon and fatback, cornmeal, and molasses. In fact, in the South at this time, the word meat is synonymous with fatback and bacon. And so they refer to their diet as the three M's: meat, which means bacon and fatback, meal, cornmeal, and molasses. This causes anxiety for Northern reformers, but it also causes anxiety for racial reformers like Booker T. Washington. Booker T. Washington took very seriously the emerging disciplines of dietary science and home economics. And he wished his students did not eat so much bacon. This is him in one letter to one of his subordinates at Tuskegee. He says, they had bacon and gravy for 2 meals. They eat too much fat meat, meaning pork mostly, but especially fatty pork like bacon. Washington considered these bacon-heavy diets of Black Southerners as reminiscent of slavery. So if you're still thinking about diet as a you are what you eat, if you eat slave food, according to Washington, what are you? Right? And so he's really concerned about this diet reminiscent of slavery, emphasizing bacon. And at Tuskegee, he's hoping to help students escape these circumstances. African Americans confronted many racist stereotypes about their poor diets. The era's so-called scientists are spreading pseudo-scientific notions about African Americans and their health problems, especially after emancipation. Plus, by this time, the thin body is becoming the beauty ideal because it signifies restraint and sacrifice. And these are two virtues that the era's whites did not ascribe to African Americans. And so to counter these stereotypes, many Black leaders are pleading with their people to eat less, eat smarter, and demonstrate their respectability. So when Washington arrived at Tuskegee, he observed what everyone else observed, that the diet around him consisted of fat, salt pork, and that, yeah, when they spoke of meat, they almost always meant fat pork. And fat pork could be fat back or it could be bacon, which at the time were interchangeable terms. So Washington takes very seriously the dining habits and food consumption as a major part of his uplift mission at Tuskegee. At Tuskegee, Washington wants to teach self-reliance, thrifty spending, good manners, healthy eating to combat these negative stereotypes. In fact, he hires only one white person as a faculty member at Tuskegee, and that's Alice Kane, a nutritionist and home economist from Wisconsin. So that's how seriously he takes this mission, that he kind of starts to bend some of his own rules to get the so-called proper diet or a bourgeois diet on the plates of his students. He does. He wants to replicate Northern tastes and the legacy of free people's tastes with what he serves at Tuskegee. So he wants his students to eat beef in good condition, cut up in the best market style. At Tuskegee, students have roast beef almost every day for their midday meal, thus mimicking idealized middle-class dining habits. They're also at Tuskegee, this is actually really radical in a way, because it means that his students at Tuskegee probably eat a more varied diet and definitely eat more beef, but eat a more varied diet with beef, salmon, oysters, than most of even the white people around him in Tuskegee and Montgomery and the Black Belt of Alabama. All right, so I do want to skip ahead a little bit now and give you a little bit of insight into how this book finishes up. But I'm hoping, right, that you'll buy it and read the rest of the story. By 1977, the Senate Committee on Dietary Guidelines had called on Americans to eat less fat, less salt, and less red meat. They're also increasingly getting concerned about chemicals in the American diet. And in all of these ways, bacon becomes something equivalent to public enemy number one. Um, in fact, Dr. Michael F. Jacobson, working for the Center for Science in the Public Interest, goes on to call bacon the most dangerous food in the supermarket. And then by 1999, one nutritionist said that bacon did not even count as a meat anymore, and that it did not fit into any of the food groups in that famous 1992 food pyramid. In fact, the nutritionist goes on to say that bacon is just a salty, nitrate-ridden, fat-laden, carcinogenic thing. So by this time, bacon no longer seems to have a perfect purpose, right? Just in the course of this lecture, I have showed you how bacon is one, a remnant of the past, then two, suitable for laboring people, especially Black enslaved laborers. By the 20th century, it's considered a dangerous thing because of its fat content, its salt content, and the nitrates and nitrites. Um, and it's so, um, yeah, despised, at least by like nutritionists and reformers, that even, as I mentioned earlier, the National Pork Board and its The Other White Meat campaign, in their own literature, they're going to recommend ways to substitute out bacon for leaner cuts of pork. But here's the problem. No one wants lean pork. When consumers claim to want lean pork, they view lean pork as dry and tasteless, preferring marbled fatty pork. So, despite all the attempts to develop leaner hogs, leaner pork, um, pork still lost to chicken at the grocery store and the boneless, skinless chicken breast. Um, Ultimately, consumers had to come view fatty pork as a treat. And in the case of then things like massive bacon cheeseburgers, not an everyday meal as bacon had been for centuries. So with bacon no longer useful as a staple product in the age of refrigeration, and no longer recommended in the age of low-fat dieting, and just yeah, and concerning amid a worry about chemical additives, um, bacon had to be reborn with an emphasis on pleasure. And in the 21st century, that's what happens. In 2001, the National Pork Board creates two new campaigns. They call it, one is a grocery store facing campaign, and they call it the Don't Be Blah. And so they're trying to convince people at the grocery store that bacon is exciting and interesting. And then they also create a food service based advertising campaign called the Better with Bacon campaign. And that's what gives us something like Taco Bell's Bacon Club Chalupa and all those other bacon laden dishes that still are with us today. So it's my argument that bacon's bacon as a useful staple had to like die because we don't turn our useful, mundane staples into pop culture and gastronomic phenomena, right? And so it had to, yeah, I think it's like a biography of bacon. It died so that it could be reborn as a dangerous, decadent pleasure. And people have continued to push that further and further. So on your screen, this is the Luther burger, or what Paula Deen calls the ladies' brunch burger. And in the food writing of the time, people are emphasizing bacon as dangerous, but not as the reason to stay away from it, as the reason why it's interesting, thrilling, exciting. Um, and you see this element of danger in this quote, for example. This is Mike Danforth from PBS, NPR. Sorry, wait, don't tell me. WBEZ Chicago, says, "It is sticky. This is a meal best eaten with gloves or a hazmat suit." And in my last few minutes, I wanted to share this cartoon in particular, because it was this cartoon that I found from 1983 that really broke open this story for me and really got at the heart of what I thought was going on. So, over the course of this lecture and over the course of the book, bacon gets condemned as a food for laboring people, increasingly defined as African Americans, but also the people of the Mountain South. Um, and it's in the Mountain South. These are the people that now, in the food writing about bacon, are especially romanticized, right? So they were criticized in their own time for their bacon eating habits, but now in the 21st century, praised for their bacon eating habits. Notably, at a time when these are the same people who are now tied to the industrial food system. And so it's in this column in the accompanying cartoon where George T. Hawley, a New York Times columnist, um, starts to describe how he didn't like bacon at all. It was unappealing. He didn't like the thin, translucent strips that come in the see-through packaging at the grocery store. He says that this stuff turns to tasteless pieces of nothing in the pan, and they go from greasy rubber to dust in just a second. So, anyway, he thinks he's done with bacon. But here he is in the South at the Atlanta airport, and he sees a product called Georgia cured pepper bacon. Now, he also sees this quote, Bell and Gingham selling it to customers behind the counter, and he's immediately enchanted. So he purchases it, brings it home, and in his New York apartment, per the cartoon, as you can see, he's conjuring up a place much different than his own New York middle class apartment. Uh, the bacon has mold on the outside of it. He says, I don't back down easily. I spent 3 years in the Marines. He gets out his utility knife, but eventually has to use his bare hands to break the rind off the bacon. And so as he dealt with it, he says that he imagined a rustic Appalachian South, right? He's romanticizing the people that just a few slides ago were getting made fun of for their bacon eating habits. He says, as I sawed away, I could picture the raw-boned mountain man who had cured this thing. Scowl on his face, coonhound skulking at his feet. He imagined that the bacon had come from a hog that had gone back to the wild, he says, which the mountain man had doubtless shot in self-defense. So in previous generations, as my talk and then the book too, the American middle class was looking down on exactly this type of person. And so while Hawley was not likely to give up his comfortable New York life, he did express connection with this mountain man in his imagination. And therefore, his writing is sort of a minstrel performance. The scholarship on minstrelsy says that it's based on what is called the love-hate dialectic. Um, Hawley certainly doesn't want to actually be the mountain man, but being him temporarily allows him to say something about his own disillusionment with modern urban life, the industrial food system that provides, yeah, thin, translucent strips of bacon. But to find something more exciting and more interesting, he has to escape his New York apartment, and he can only find it in the Mountain South. And so when 21st century Americans praise and eat bacon, they're linking a desire to escape, at least temporarily, their structured, standardized, sedentary lives. And this entails nostalgia for an imagined foodways of rural people. But of course, something like Callaway Gardens's Georgia cured pepper bacon is often at a price point out of reach of the very people it claims to romanticize. So craft bacon like this evokes rusticity at a price point out of reach for most of the people claimed to have lived and eaten this way. So I think at this time, I'd like to wrap that up, and I'd love to take your questions. And um, maybe I'll stop this here. So yeah, please raise your hand. I guess I see a couple questions. Catherine, do you want to go ahead?
I enjoyed the Luther burger. I don't know, had you had one?
No, but I'm teaching a class right now and I call it What's Good to Eat. And we're tracing the answers to those questions over US history.
I
Um,
have had a Luther burger.
okay. We're gonna
We
make it
got,
next week in class. That's what I was gonna say.
oh, okay, but it wasn't part of a class. It was a bunch of foodies together who wanted to try it. And we asked a hot dog stand in Evanston, Illinois. It's no longer in business. It was called Wiener and Still Champion. We brought the donuts from, it was that Southern donut with the glazed donuts that you could sometimes get a warm sample if you were standing there. I don't remember the name. Sorry, maybe somebody else does. And it was named after Luther Vandross, the singer.
Hmm.
I don't know
Yeah.
if that was, and we had this guy make us a Luther burger. And there was like probably 8 of us standing there, and we cut them into quarters. And it was finished. And it had lots of bacon. It was probably dressed up a little more than what you have a picture of. And we were kind of somewhat horrified because we were started to recognize how many calories were sitting there, even if you had it cut into a quarter. But of course, we all ate ours. And nobody went back and asked for a full one. We were prepared for that. But we got so much fun out of that one burger. And at that time, I think Luther Vandross had already died. I don't know if people remember, but he was this black singer, and sometimes he was very zoftig, and then sometimes he was skinny, and I think it affected his heart or something. But anyway, it
Yeah.
was
He
fun to
was
see that.
a long time sufferer of diabetes and he had passed away by the time that the burger came out. But yeah, it is associated with there are two claims to inventing it, but both of them link it back to Luther Vandross. But yeah, you're getting at what so in the second half of the book, it is about how in the food writing about bacon, there's a lot of emphasis on bacon as dangerous, but as that being part of the excitement. So getting caught up in high calorie meals. And then so right, it's not that big of a jump then to get to something like the bacon flavored old fashioned or Bloody Mary or donut. Because if people are going to sin anyway after a week of rice cakes and Slim Fast shakes, sinning tastes pretty good, I think. And that's how it often comes across in the food writing.
And it happens that my favorite cut is the pork shoulder because you can do so much with it. Um, uh, yeah. Anyway, I want other people to talk. Sorry.
Yeah, I think John?
Yes. Yeah, I really enjoy your talk, and I have a question. Say in the mid 1860s, was bacon similar to today in salt and smoke flavor and kind of fattiness, or do you think bacon has changed? That bacon we know today, do you think that is similar to what the pioneers would have had in 1860s and so forth?
Yeah, great question. So, in the time you're talking about, and so for most of the 19th century and earlier, bacon was a very broad term. Um, and they used it to mean almost all cured and smoked pork. So here's what that means, and this is how it helps answer the question. They would have identified it if they identified bacon as higher quality, they called it streaky bacon. And that is mostly similar to what we would have today in its fat to lean ratio. Um, But bacon at the time meant so much else too. They would talk about fat bacon, which was probably the fattier ends, instead of like a center cut style. Um, they refer to Midland, which is again like a center cut, leaner style, like we can get in the grocery store. But bacon could mean so much else too, and it was a synonym for what we would call fatback. So the answer is bacon for so many people was all over the place, and what it looked like and tasted like. But bacon did mean cured, salted, and smoked. But how much leanness there was and what the ratio was depended on your class status. Um, and so, yeah, the wealthier people would have eaten something close to what we have today called streaky or middling. Yeah, I mean, the term means everything until the industrial food system. And especially when you get to like self-service grocery stores, that's when you need a level of conformity. And so when you say bacon, you know it's going to be the same thing at every store, more or less. And that it's going to be the same thing week to week, month to month. But before the industrial food system, that sort of uniformity and conformity is impossible. And so, yeah, in that time, bacon meant pretty much anything.
Thank you.
Yeah, of course. Thank you. There is a question in the chat about the Irish, and I'm happy to. I don't exactly know. I mean, I've read the book, Rot and an Imperial History of the Irish Famine, but don't necessarily recall the part mentioned here in the chat. But I do have a small section on bacon in the British Isles generally, but in Ireland in particular. Saint Bridget. Saint Bridget's able to do effectively what Jesus Christ did. She was able to turn, I think, two strips of bacon into seven strips of bacon, and because her father was upset with her for giving some of it to the dog. And so Saint Bridget is one of the saints of Ireland and Catholicism, and very special in Ireland. And yeah, it does one of her miracles is conjuring bacon. Let's see. Do you see a time that we will see commodity pork products back to their? Yeah, so that's just it. Like, okay, so I'll read the whole question. Do you see a time that we will see commodity pork products back to their original former delicious fatty glory? Um, I don't know about things. I'm a historian. I do the past and not the future. But that is something you're hinting at something that is different about bacon than is true about a lot of our other foods. So just briefly mention that the pork industry, the National Pork Board, really thought that something like pre-cooked bacon was going to be a much bigger hit. It's huge in food service because food service can buy it really cheap, right? Microwave it, put it on a sandwich for an upcharge. But pre-cooked bacon was really disappointing for the pork industry for at-home consumption. And when I went around and talked to bacon producers, they talk about how bacon defies a lot of our current trends. Um, we do, we seek convenience in so many parts of our diets these days, but bacon defies that. In fact, and it's I think Stephen Berger of Berger Smokehouses in Missouri said that they saw sales of their slab bacon skyrocket during the pandemic because it was something that took time to prepare, and people enjoy actually the process of cooking it, where that's not true of so much of what we eat now. And they liked the kind of gourmet ability to like slice it to their specific needs. Um, and so, um, yeah, I think in terms of bacon, the fattiness is something that they increasingly highlight as what's desirable about it. Especially in craft bacon that use these heritage breeds hogs that do develop different fat and different distributions of intramuscular fat. Uh, Upton Sinclair's book, The Jungle. So, yeah, so there is an element of, and it's in my chapter on the Gilded Age and Progressive Era, but these advertisements for bacon, they're to someone today, they wouldn't come across as very appealing. Um, in the ads for bacon in, say, 1910, 1920, Hormel, Armour, and all these other meat packers, the ads say things like "okayed by Uncle Sam." Like they're very prideful of the cleanliness of their factories. In fact, they're putting the factory front and center in their ads, and I don't think you could imagine right a meat packer doing that right now in their packaging or their advertisements, highlighting the actual factory. But there is a lot of faith in the industrial food process at the time, to take the products of nature and perfect them. And so in the rhetoric about bacon, they talk about the very things that actually make bacon unappealing to us. The uniformity of the slices, the thinness of it, the daintiness of the flavor. Um, and yeah, they take a lot of pride in the industry's ability to do those things. And yeah, in the wake of Upton Sinclair, um, these ads do have like an Uncle Sam logo on them to uh, um, prove to people that it's safe, and maybe even safer than the stuff you could get locally. So yeah, they're very proud, or they try to forefront industry in the factory. Bacon used to come in hermetically sealed jars before the vacuum packaging. It used to come in a jar, which I think would actually be kind of nice because the packaging is terrible. Um, but yeah, they would broadcast it as how safe it is.
If there's no more pig-related questions, when we talked earlier today, you mentioned you're using community cookbooks to teach your class. And I just thought you might want to tell people just a little bit of how that goes, if you
Yeah,
don't
so
mind.
no, of course. So as a historian, I'm trying to broaden my students' perspective of what counts as a primary source. Right there, they come to class familiar with the usuals, right? Newspaper article, right? The census, a political speech, something like that. But yeah, I try to get them to read community cookbooks as products of their time, right? So if it's from the 70s, what kinds of things do they emphasize? How do they portray men and women? How do they portray labor? How do they talk about knowledge and science? And what do they assume about the consumer, right? What do they assume about the consumer's ability to get certain ingredients or understand a certain technique? So yeah, we bring up the cookbooks a few times a year and pass them around um, to study almost like you would a piece of literature.
That's fantastic. Fantastic. Do you have any more questions, or we have done we've done our job and you've done yours. And thank you very much. One of the issues I'm having at the moment is low vision. It will get straightened out. But he was our speaker today was so helpful. We made more demands on him than we normally do. And I'm glad he rose to the occasion. So thank you so much. As you noticed, he helped bring people in. He read his own, questions in the chat. I just can't do it at the moment. So thank you, thank you, thank you. We
Yeah,
appreciate
thank
your
you
coming
for
tonight.
having me. Please reach out and yeah, please look up the book. I believe Kathy provided a link to purchase it through the press and through bookshop.org, which supports local bookstores. But yeah, ask your local bookstore to carry it. That would mean a lot to me.
We will do our best to mean a lot to you. If you don't mind, you can shut us down because I can't find where that little button is. I'm telling you, this eyesight thing is driving me nuts. Thanks again. Good night.
Yeah, thank you.